So I'll do, there you go. But when I edit these, I always use the welcome as the kind of the moment to start from. So good. You can see in the bottom of the screen, we're looking at, we're now into Matthew 18. I've kind of, I put the name out in the little email, and I use the kind of the subtype which I'm using now, the lost limbs and lost lambs. Although ironically, as I looked at the passage this morning in preparation to put move it across and into the PowerPoint to put the text in, I'm less focused on the kind of the parable of the lost sheep is there, and the if your right hand offends you, cut it off. There are some other bits that kind of come earlier on that I thought probably put some of the emphasis into. But anyway, there you go. There's the working title. Just to kind of remind us the context. So at the end of last time, because we were going to see the context is quite relevant in terms of there's similar wording and thematically, I think therefore one passage is clearly being linked by Matthew to the other. So Matthew 17, the end of Matthew chapter 17, the final kind of phrase, just to kind of sum it up, is Jesus. I've summarised this from the last two verses. Jesus said to him in that context was Peter, in which case the children are exempt, but so as not to scandalise them. So I've put the wording there. If you remember, the context was they've been challenged. Do you pay the temple tax? Did your master pay it? Jesus has been itinerating outside of the kind of the Jewish areas in Galilee. He's come back into Capernaum. He's tried to kind of sneak in without being seen too clearly. That's my assumption. He's not made a big thing in terms of coming in. He's staying at Peter's house, which presumably means Andrew is there. They've noticed, they've sent a delegation noting that in the records he's not shown as, he hasn't been to Passover this particular year. Or we're not told about him going up to Passover, and nothing has happened. So we assume that he's missed Passover. That's not necessarily something to be shocking. I meet people who think that every Jew had to go every single year to Passover. But of course they live right the way across the empire. And so while it would have been quite regular, it's not impossible for Jesus not to have gone. And actually, just in terms of the crowds and the interest he generates, it seems this particular year he's not done so. Often people paid the temple tax at Passover, and then the kind of the details would go back. But someone locally who's noticed, because Jesus has based himself in Capernaum, that he's not showing as having been paid the tax. They're challenged about it, and it's in that context that this little phrase that the children, of course, as Jesus points out to Peter, don't normally pay taxes to their parents. They're exempt, but we're not going to scandalise them or not going to offend them. So that little word to scandalise, the Greek word actually is scandalizo, but we normally see it in our English translations as being translated as causing offence or caused to stumble. But it is the kind of it's the word we get scandal from. So just wanted to highlight that. And then in case the children, and the children there is actually sons. I translated it as children rather than sons in this case because as in English, the word son, while it can be a male child, a male offspring, it's used in a broad sense within the ancient world. In particular, you find within the Bible, it's used in a broad sense to illustrate kind of physical kinship, and it can include the girls as well. But it is a word that technically is the sort of the male child, and in that kind of context, it's a male child who might become an heir. And there's always a slight. It's always worth highlighting because we use the words differently in English. So when you adopt a son, you effectively appoint an heir. When we adopt a child or adopt a son, we think of a baby coming into the family. Whereas what we have is the word that's used here for a son, it's the same word that's used of Jesus as the Son of God, the huios, this little word here, is often the child who has an expectation of growing into an adult who administers an inheritance, but they're not there yet. Now, why have I made a big issue of... So there you go, huios. Sons in the sense of potential heirs. There you go, I put it in there. So that's how Matthew 17 is finishing. And it becomes part of the context, because as we move into Matthew 18, we get that little phrase, in that same hour. So there it goes. So now remember, when we've thought about the way Matthew's put his gospel together, he's presented a broad sort of historical movement of Jesus's activities and events. But in particular, when it comes to kind of things that Jesus taught, he often draws them into places where they make most sense. But so when he uses a phrase like "in that same hour" in Matthew's gospel, that much more clearly ties what's coming next to what went before. So very often Matthew's gospel is, here's an event, and then we have another event. But when you really analyse it and compare it with the other gospels, you see they may not have sat next to each other. They may not have even been in the same order. He's kind of packaged the events and so on. But when he uses a much clearer sense of joining words, I think we therefore take him seriously in that in this context, Matthew's saying it's not just like, here's the next thing I'm going to tell you. He's actually saying it was at the same context and in the same place. And therefore what's just happened colours and flavours what's about to happen. And you can see that as you look through, because the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of the heavens? So in the same hour, so in what way does what's just happened feed that question? So obviously Jesus has been staying with Peter. So presumably Andrew's in the house too, because it's their house. There are others of his disciples are with him. Some of whom, therefore, as we looked at last time, may be under the age of 21, because you only pay the temple tax when you become over 20. Over 20. 21's the English thing to do, isn't it? Once you pass 20 years of age, because it talks in Exodus of every adult who's above 20, and the coming out should pay this towards the upkeep of the sanctuary. You see, so some of Jesus' disciples would be over 20 and some probably under, because Andrew at least doesn't seem to be in view here. And so there's that whole kind of context now. So Jesus has paid for Peter, but perhaps he hasn't paid for Bartholomew, or he hasn't paid for Judas. There's all of those kinds of questions. And so there's a kind of a context to who then is the greatest in the kingdom. And as we run through the text, I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. We're going to see that there's references now to little children, which is a slightly different word. It's paidon rather than huios, and it can generally be generic of any sex. But it's the little children who tend to grow up into the sons who then become adopted as heirs. So there's a kind of progression in that. And you'll see right the way through this passage, we keep running across this phrase, which in your English translations will regularly say offend or cause to stumble or cause to sin. But it is all based on that same Greek word, the scandalizo, that we had when Jesus has said we don't want to offend anybody. So what we're going to read kind of gives us some context to Jesus is teaching Peter. We don't want to cause offence to them. We don't want to create an unnecessary stumbling block for them. It's very in line. We're going to see the themes that Jesus picks up with the things that Paul talks about not letting your freedom become a stumbling block to somebody else who doesn't have it. So you don't mind eating meat that you bought from the market, which means it may well have been sacrificed to a foreign god. You have a freedom to do that. Somebody else feels, I don't want to touch that because that may have come from the butcheries of Athena. So we know, I may be able to drink a glass of wine, but somebody who's come from an alcoholic background in our church can't do. I don't want to cause an offence or a stumbling to them. Those kind of ideas that Paul picks up. So here it is in Jesus' words. We find it developed within the wider church context. The kind of the two are interplaying really with each other. So the verse itself, in that same hour, disciples came. They said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of the heavens?" I've left the plural in because it's there in Matthew, and for me, this is a personal thing because I found myself kind of going against the flow very often on this, in taking seriously the testimony of the early church that Matthew was originally constructed in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language. For me, this is one of the big markers. That there are a couple of grammatic things and linguistic things, which would indicate the truth of that statement, that originally Matthew was written in Hebrew, one of which is that the word heaven in Hebrew is plural. And so I've touched on this before, but yet again, here it is. And I like to kind of leave it in the plural because it kind of is a constant reminder right the way through the text of Matthew that the gospel is written in a way that looks like it's had Aramaic or Hebrew origins. So it confirms that testimony from the early church. So who's the greatest in the kingdom of the heavens? And so then what Jesus does, he calls a little child to himself. So now we've gone to the little. So this is, we've talked about sons who don't need to pay, but now we're talking about people who are smaller than that. So we've kind of gone down a level. So you're in this place, you're a son who could become an heir, potentially. But don't forget that actually there's little children are involved as well. And so he calls a child to himself and he set them in their midst and said, truly I say to you, if you don't turn around and become as the little children, I missed a word out. You will not grow. You'll not grow in the kingdom of heavens. So more typically it will say in an English translation, if you don't something like convert, or if you don't turn. I think King James says turn. Some translations put convert, but the trouble with conversion is it has too much of the flavour of I wasn't a Christian and now I am a Christian. But the Greek word that's being used here, the turning around, is you've got to kind of turn your perspective upside down. So you're thinking in terms of yourself now as mature, but actually you mustn't despise these little ones. And you go back to what we were looking at before. There is a sense in which for all of us we understand it's ridiculous to be paying taxes to our own Father in heaven. So we know that, but we're not going to offend and cause problems for those who haven't yet met this maturity, haven't grown into this maturity. So you'll often see that turnaround or convert, change, become as little children. You might come into, is often the way it's put, but again, the Greek phrase, if you look at it, is a very much, well, first of all, the Greek word is never used outside of being the aorist. I don't know if it's the aorist sense, which is something that's continuous. So what that means is the Greek word that's actually used here is a compound. Actually, it's in and the kind of the word come and whatever, but it's never a finished thing. It's never I have come in. It's always about I'm coming into. And so it's got an implication of growth. So you will actually see, if you look in things like Strong's, it will say it can be arise or grow. The word can mean grow or arise or get bigger. And I think by putting it in that sense, to kind of grow up into, it helps us understand that it's not that Jesus is saying, unless you're like a little child, you won't get saved, which is the way we've sometimes put it. Now, of course, that is covered. So unless you can humble yourself like a child, you might not get converted. The trouble is, by using the word convert and then come into as if it's a one-off event, we miss the fact that there's something of the dynamic of how we grow in the kingdom that is here in the text. So it's there in the Greek, but we lose it sometimes in translation. So just to be kind of clear, because I think I'm waffling a little bit now. The reason I've kind of fiddled around and tried to explain the wordings on these things is because the emphasis of the text, I think, is much more about I'm here today, I'm saved, I've got no problems about the fact I'm saved, but I want to continue to grow. It's not that I have now come into the kingdom and it's full stop and it's all gone, but I want to keep growing up I want to keep rising up in the process. I want to keep developing maturity. Well, in which case I have to make sure I keep my mindset turned over, so I understand that I don't look at my maturity and say, aren't I doing well? I don't need to pay this. I've got this freedom. I've suddenly realised that, if you got saved into a traditional Methodist, you might say, so we don't drink. Why? Because so many people in Methodism have come from situations where alcohol has ruined lives and families. Then you go, but I'm a mature Christian now, so now I can do it whenever and wherever. Well, that's not the case. I don't have status when I was a child, I say child, when I was a teenager, I was in the cadet force they had a cadet force in our school, and so I was in the RAF cadets, and they always used to encourage you to get promoted. So you go kind of corporal, sergeant, flight sergeant, and so on. And they used to use this little phrase, which is very kind of true in the secular world, which was rank has its privileges, RHIP. And so we look at growth as it kind of, now I've got this privilege, whereas Jesus is saying we want to turn that whole thing around. If you're going to continue to grow in the kingdom of the heavens, if you're going to continue to grow in your stature in this way, yes, you might come into a certain place of freedom, but we're not despising what we've come through and the fact that others need to kind of find their own place of growth. We need to be conscious of it. So actually, we need to be humbling ourselves and freely and voluntarily submitting ourselves to things which we may have come into an understanding of our place in Christ, where we think, well, it's not important for a child of the kingdom. I don't need to do it that way because I'm a child of the kingdom and I know who my Father is in heaven. But we're not supposed to think like that. Turn it around. The same one is the greatest in the kingdoms of the heavens, is the one who's great, therefore. You've asked the question, who's the greatest? Why have you asked the question, who's the greatest? Well, Peter got his taxes paid for him. That was nice. Yep, okay, well, he got his taxes paid for him by a supernatural miracle. That's a wonderful privilege, but it's not a right to him. And actually, the whole question is the wrong way around. We don't see our growth in the kingdom based on the things that the supernatural ways God's looked after us and so on. We want to stay in that humble attitude that wants to keep growing, and therefore is preferring the growth of those around us to the expression of our own superiority. And I don't want to sound, because I'm sure I've done it myself, and yet I see it sometimes around the place, not in bad people, but very often as we learn and we grow in the faith, we want to use those badges of things for the kind of the sense of marking ourselves and our growth out amongst others. And yet if we do it in a way, as we're going to see, that causes offence, Jesus has some very strong words on that. And so I want to take on that understanding. And I realised it as a senior church leader, how important it was not to dismiss the theological understandings of those who are you are leading and who are therefore growing. So while you want them to grow, you don't want to do so in a way that makes them feel their smallness or feel their immaturity in it, if I can put it that way. Anyway, we'll get there. We'll get to the verses where Jesus, of course, challenges us on that. So whoever will humble himself like this little child, that same one is the greatest in the kingdom of heavens. So somehow keeping that attitude that recognises the journey. I'm just looking for the... okay, I think it's coming on the next slide. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to be scandalised, so suddenly actually we would regularly put the word offence in there, but I left the word scandalised in to kind of show that connection. If anyone who takes an attitude that actually causes an offence, i.e. causes to stumble, causes to fall over, to deter from their own growth, it's better for him that a heavy millstone should be hung around his neck and he be sunk in the depths of the sea. Well, that seems quite drastic. But we've got to remember, we see regularly in Jesus, and it's part of the idiom of his day and the culture of Israeli Hebrew culture, that people often will talk. They will talk in the conversation is very hyperbolic. In other words, it uses extremes as contrasts. And so actually, funny enough, just in the last week, I've had someone had the question to me about, when Jesus says to love anyone who wants to follow me must love me and hate their parents. which to our English way of speaking feels like a terrible thing to say, to hate your parents. Aren't we supposed to honour them? But to understand that the style of speaking that Jesus is using kind of uses extremes to kind of highlight the direction. And it makes sense, because obviously if you think about that love and hate, if you said, well, if you're going to follow me, you've got to love me 40% you've got to love me 60% and your parents 40%. Well, then you're kind of working out, where am I? Whereas that if loving one, hating the other, that covers all of us wherever we feel we are. We're all challenged in one sense to put Jesus slightly higher by that style of speaking. So here, it's not obviously a statement to actually literally go and take somebody, put a millstone around their neck and throw them into the sea and drown them, but to sink them in the depths of the sea. But it's the kind of, actually, it would be there's something about your progress and growth in the kingdom that it is like hanging a millstone around your neck if you're being like this, because we're hampering our own growth. So Jesus has already said this humility that doesn't patronize people as they're in their growing place is really important for you to grow. But actually, if you are creating offense to them by kind of going to them, why do you do it like that? Don't you realize Sabbath is a spiritual principle? You don't have to. It doesn't matter if you don't keep it on a particular day of the week. Well, that might be theologically true, but someone who's trying to do it that way is working from what they do understand and trying to do it. And if I'm patronizing of that and I create a scandal in them, I can cause an offense. And that offense is something that Jesus says, actually, that's a problem to you too. It would be better for a heavy millstone to be hung around your neck, to be sunk in the depths of the sea. Hyperbolic language, or hyperbolic language, or it's kind of extreme, but that's the way the culture speaks. And then Jesus kind of turns it around. So woe to the world, because scandalous causes of stumbling. It's the same word, but I'm trying to transition from scandal to the cause of stumbling. You could translate it both ways. Those things that cause people to stumble, to kind of doubt their faith, lose their faith, to continue to persevere in their faith, to stop those things, they're going to be there. No doubt scandals must come, but woe to the man by whom that cause comes. So all of those words, scandals cause, scandalous causes of stumbling, they're all technically the same Greek word. But for the sake of English, I've kind of broken them up a little bit. But you see the sort of the flow. And that, when we see it in this context, Jesus is saying it to people who've been following him for some years, who are coming into real maturity. But in this maturity, he's giving them a very serious warning. It's something that's struck me for the last few years, but even in the last couple of months, it's really been brought home to me. How many people I know who are currently no longer following the Lord, and when you talk to them, or let's say they're no longer fruitfully or actively seeming to follow the Lord, you will find an offence and a real disappointment, a real hurt that has been caused by the communities and people of faith. And I don't want to condemn other brothers and sisters in Christ at all, because we have to apply this to ourselves. That's the part of this passage. But actually, you hear it constantly. I was watching a very serious kind of conversation debate, and they're talking about actually. I remember. Thinking about what it was. There's a little clip by Jordan Peterson, who's kind of every kind of Christian's favourite non-Christian commentator, if that makes sense. He's not Christian, but he kind of points out things that we think, yeah, that makes sense. And he makes a statement. He said almost every atheist he's met has been. So this is a non-Christian who he was a psychoanalyst, took people through therapy. Every atheist he's met almost always has deep disappointment and hurt by people who represent truth, and that hurt by those, or disappointment from those who are representing truth, has caused them a rejection of that truth. You see, so that's interesting. You're hearing someone from a psychoanalytic background describing something that often you encounter. And so he in that context, he even talks about Richard Dawkins, and that saying he doesn't know this, but he said from some of the things that Richard Dawkins said, you can see that even in him, as the arch new atheist. So taking this very, very seriously, that it's very possible for us, even as we've kind of walked with the Lord for a while, just somehow in our attitudes to scandalize, to create a disappointment in the sense of where we're going. And we're not supposed to ignore it. We're not supposed to go, once saved, always saved. I haven't lost my salvation. It's okay. It's their issue. It's down to them. They either weren't called in the first place, or it's their own sin. It's not my fault. But as is always the way, Jesus is saying, well, that there may be some truth in that, but don't miss your own culpabilities. Take it seriously, because actually all sorts of reasons why people might fall away from the Lord and following the Lord exist out there in the world, but you shouldn't be the one who does it. Don't be the one who causes it. How do we cause it? Well, sometimes it's just because we have a patronising attitude towards those who haven't walked as long as we have. And as I say, I'm going to put my hand up and say I can do that. I can think of specific people and specific times and places where I've definitely behaved in ways that could potentially be understood as scandalising them. In my superiority, in my insecurity, I want them to know that I'm cleverer than they are, or I've been following the Lord for longer. It's an issue that's common to all of us and a challenge to all of us. And really, I think what the passage is trying to draw our attention to is humility is at the heart of growth. Non-humility is at the heart of people losing something of their own advantages in growth and growing in Jesus, moving up in the kingdom. And therefore, don't trivialize it. Take it seriously. Be quick to apologize when we need to. Be quick to admit your own failings and faults and so those things, because that's the way in which we don't patronize those who are younger than us in the faith coming up. So now Jesus is you're now applying it to himself. So if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, so in other words, now it's not just in the wider community, but even in your own life and habits and doing things. Are there things that cause you regularly into the place where you start to elevate pride or that to actually justify them, you have to explain to yourself why you're allowed to do this and others aren't? Well, actually, you need to cut those off and cast it from you, because it's better for you to grow up in life. It's the same idea again, come into, but that coming into, it's continuous as the sense of growth. It's better for you to grow up in life crippled or lame. And I quite like the contrast. So in this life, it's better for me to kind of hamper myself by cutting the things off that might cause me to stumble. Then have your 2 hands and feet, but then be cast into eternal fire. I don't want to take time on the term eternal fire here, but we saw when we were going through the Sermon on the Mount, that the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus very clearly reflects various different rabbinic traditions around him. So he addresses some of the teachings of Shammai, who's a leading Pharisee, Hillel, who was a leading Pharisee, but actually we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, just in the last, since they've all been published, that in which, if we understand them as the Essenes, the righteous ones, and their teaching, that they taught very similar couplet of things that you find in the Sermon on the Mount, which is running people's reputation down. You fool, you empty head, raka, you fool. And then actually the issues of adultery and sexual adultery. And they put both in the context of you risking hell or risking Gehenna. But there, as we saw, Gehenna was much more a purifying fire. So most people came through it. That's something we forget. We want to turn it into the eternal consequence of life and sin and so on, rather than the purifying fire. But it actually, if we see it in that kind of context, what you see Jesus saying in this sense is, you better deal with it in this life with something that's kind of simple and physical, than to actually stand on the judgment day, and while you are welcomed into the fold and so on, that there is something of that experience, which we've seen again. We saw a few weeks ago that Jesus never ignores, even though a lot of kind of Christian modern theology kind of doesn't see a place for punishment of the elect, that there's something of both reward and and dealing with the consequences of our immaturity and our sin in this life. It's just that it's a refining process. So let's not kind of pretend it's not there because we have a theology that says that we avoid all of that. I'm careful when I'm saying those things. What I'm saying is, I try and shape things based on the full story of Scripture, and I give priority to the teachings of Jesus. So I totally understand those other passages, but actually Jesus regularly puts it in that kind of context. So here in this place, he puts the consequences of eternal fire, which, as I said, we saw when we were looking at the Sermon on the Mount, is a kind of a purifying process to deal with the things that the way you've sinned in life, even though you're still part of the eternal kingdom. And then he turns it around. If your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out, cast it from you. It's better if you grow up in life one-eyed than having two eyes and be cast into the Gehenna of fire. Same place, same concept. There's an obvious hyperbole involved here, as has kind of been pointed out. There's that kind of sense if my hand causes me to sin, and so I cut it off literally and throw it away, and then my other hand causes me to sin, so I cut that one off. Well, then how do I throw it away? Because I haven't got one hand or the other. Those stupid kind of little jokes that people have made over the years, but they kind of illustrate in one sense the very obvious sense in which this is not a literal thing to do. It's much more a symbolic, hyperbolic illustration of take this seriously. Try and deal with it. Try and avoid the refining process. Get refined in this life by the Holy Spirit, rather than kind of come before the Lord and say, and then have those things. I'm aware that I've touched on things that are quite deep, in the sense of there isn't the time in these kind of lunch times to really unpack the fire that consumes. That's the phrase I use from the Old Testament, that is there in the presence of God. Anyway, so see that you don't look down on any of these little ones. And I was tempted here, that's where I was looking for the phrase, and I knew it appeared somewhere. I was tempted to translate as don't patronise. Because it's not as if we kind of come in and it's kind of, hello kids, do you want to buy some cigarettes from me? We're not doing that kind of thing to cause them to sin. What we're doing is those who are young in their faith, it's something in our attitude towards them. Don't look down on any of them, for I tell you that in the heavens their angels always see the face of the Father who's in the heavens. And there's a beautiful little phrase here. And again, I don't think we should be too hung up in trying to translate it literally, that as if kind of the day I get saved, my angel is right there, right in Jesus' face. What it's saying is that they have a kind of they have an advocate who's right there in the presence of God, who has God's attention when they're in the early days of their faith, where they're not yet at their sonship levels, but they are little children and they're trying to grow. Whether that's physical children, or whether it's spiritual children, because the phrasing is used of both in the New Testament or in the Gospels even. They really are little children. So when they're little children in their innocence, sometimes a little child in their innocence, when you ask them a question like, who ate the cake, says, I didn't eat it. And, well, they've lied. So we're really heavy on them. And we cause them to stumble by our harshness. Whereas actually there is a kind of a grace and an access in their innocence, and equally as someone comes into as they try to explore their kind of their understanding who Jesus is, who might kind of say, "Isn't it wonderful? Jesus has helped me." Obviously, it's kind of like Buddha, because I've got a Buddhist friend at school, and that might, in one sense, be it's just them trying to grow in their own faith, and we can look at them and go, oh well, I'm much more mature than you, and I'll be harsh about it. That's the thing that's being addressed. Because the Son of Man has come to save that which is lost. So we now have this that verse 11 doesn't appear in every copy of Matthew, the oldest copies of Matthew. It seems it's more of a kind of the editor's comment than something that Jesus said. So in other words, Jesus would have said the thing about their angels. There's a kind of an advocacy in heaven for new believers, young children, those who are less wise in their understanding and their growth into who God is. And then Matthew has perhaps included in, and it may or may not have then been in his original Hebrew version, say, so it's not in every single text, but that the Son of Man came to save that which is lost by helping to bring a focus. And so then in Matthew's Gospel, what Matthew now does is he inserts the parable of the lost sheep. Which probably that is an insertion. It may not have been exactly part of the flow. The reason I'm saying that is in Luke's Gospel, for instance, the parable of the lost sheep belongs very clearly to the briefing of the 72 and the group of disciples before the wider group of disciples kind of start to enter into missions, or as they're entering into missions. So it comes later. But Matthew, in his way of often bringing things thematically in, illustrates what's gone on, this priority of the Son of Man coming for the lost, rather than those who are in the fold already, which is why we watch our attitudes with those who are outside or young in their faith, by then moving on to the parable of the lost sheep. So what do you think? So if some man has 100 sheep and one of them's gone astray, well, won't he leave the 99, go to the hills and seek the stray? And if he finds it genuinely or really or truly, really, I'm telling you this, and let's notice that we sometimes just treat it as a figure of speech, but I think Jesus is saying, no, stop and think about this. And the reason I like it is because it's something that modern psychology will tell you is the case, and we can actually see it now. You can put people's heads in the fMRI scanner, and you can see how different parts of your brain fire off. You genuinely, everybody genuinely is happier, happier when they find something or get something small more than what they've got. So in other words, if I'm walking down the road and I suddenly see something flopping towards me, and I put my foot on it, pick it up, and it's a £10 note, I will be happier with that and feel more blessed than I will by the fact that at the end of the month I might get paid for some work I've done, multiple times the amount of that. But you see, once you've got it, and the fact is I live in a nice house that costs thousands of those, but once you've got it, you don't actually live in the joy of it, if that makes sense. There is a joy that comes with the coming of something. And it's so real, and there's all sorts of phenomena that flow out of it. So when Jesus says, truly, really, I am telling you, this is the truth, stop and think about it. When you might have loads of stuff, but it's the bit you find or the bit that comes to you that actually goes, yay, and actually elevates our kind of sense of happiness and sense of blessedness and sense of gladness. And in a similar way, we also feel the loss of the small thing more than something we've never had. You know, if there's something we've never had. And the wonderful thing in the way we're made like that is, if, for instance, as a child, I lose a leg or I lose a foot or something, after a while, I've never had it, and I don't notice it in the same way. But if as a teenager somebody loses a foot, that loss is such a huge shock in terms of everything else. So we tend to notice small gains and small losses much more than big absences or big presences, if all that makes sense. and so God says, in the same way that you're like that, you notice those things as you get the new thing. In the same way, it's not the will of your Father who is in heaven that any of these little ones should perish. He delights over them and feels their loss. That doesn't mean he doesn't love the big, but there's something immediate and joyful when the returning the repentant sinner, the returning child, the new convert comes in. The young disciple is making little bits of progress, even to give it its wider context here, as they're growing. The Father is delighting in that journey. That is not to say, therefore, he's bored with those who've been around for a long time, but there's just something fresh about it, and Jesus uses that very human emotion and illustrates something in the Father's perspectives. So I think we're coming towards, there we go, thanks for watching. Come to the end of this little kind of flow, which is probably happening there in Capernaum, as Jesus has now come back into home. He's drawing those folks together. And hopefully, as we kind of I said at the beginning, I called it lost limbs and lost lambs, and we did cover those. But I think the thing that really ties the whole thing together is this idea of, as Jesus has been addressing with his disciples, they're coming now into a level of maturity in their discipleship, and Jesus is preparing them to lead beyond him. So as we're going to go forward in the next few weeks, although we don't cover the 72 because it's only covered in Luke, but we're going to see that happens in the next phase. But the point of the sending out the 72 is the 72, of course, is a nice multiple of 12. So it seems to me almost certain that Jesus has now given, if you like, a little group of sub-disciples, a group of his own disciples have been split up amongst the 12. They are now having to lead groups like he has led 12. So if he puts them in pairs, for instance, you got 6 pairs, and 6 pairs, if you give them 12 people each pair 12, you get 72. So Jesus is now, he's reproducing himself, and at this kind of key phase, he is drawing attention to the fact they're growing, but they now have a responsibility for those who are coming after them. And their attitudes towards those who are coming after them is very, very key. And he wants them to turn their thinking upside down to recognize that their maturity is really seen, their identity is really seen by their service and facilitating of others in their growth, rather than seeing others' growth as an authentication of who they are. It's that whole turnaround logic. So hopefully that's been a helpful take on the passage. It may be one of those, because I've read these verses, you read them so many times, and you often skim them and go, yeah, I know what that means, and my hope is, not because to avoid the thing, to do it from a humble point of view, to say that it is often because of doing these sessions I stop and I read them slower, some of these passages, and you start thinking, actually no, I see this now. But hopefully it's been useful. That's the thing to say. And so I'll ask the question as I normally do. Does anyone want to ask anything or make any observations at this point?
Kristen, I put them in the chat a while back when you were talking about a sense of continuous process of growth.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I misunderstood what you said, but because you mentioned the word aorist.
Oh yeah. So I may have
action. I usually.
Yeah, that's right. I can't. Let me go and see if I can find a comment on it. Hang on a second while I'm.
The turn word.
While I'm here. Thanks for asking the question. Yeah, is the turn word. I'm just looking for it in my. Okay, so it's the come into is sometimes translated as come into. So after the term, it talks about come into. I'm just reading what it says here in Strong's. Middle voice, a primary verb used in the present and imperfect. So it's imperfect tense is really what I should have been saying. So it's present imperfect. In other words, it's something you're in the process of rather than something that's completed. And being supplied by a middle voice. So it's not, the word aorist shouldn't have been used by me at all. So my apologies for confusing things.
Well, thanks. That's fine. I was confused with the aorist word. Yeah, present.
No. So yeah, no. But it says here used only in the present and imperfect tenses, and imperfect, which of course means that it's not complete. So it's in a process rather than something that you've done and is finished.
Very helpful. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying it, Bob. I was going to say it's not an excuse, but I was watching some of my. I'm watching my own videos from teaching things the other day, and I regularly I will use the wrong name or whatever, and I do blame my strokes for some of those things. But I look back and think, oh, hopefully people got from the context I didn't mean that person, I meant the other person. But,
I was looking at verse 10, Kristen, and it talked about the little ones, angels, see how it faces it, the Father in heaven.
Yeah.
The face of my Father who is in heaven. And I wonder what we're meant to understand from that, really.
Yeah. So as I said, I wasn't necessarily really clear. I said it a few times while we were saying, I think the context that Jesus is using covers both young believers and young children, because he's kind of drawing the attention to the physical growth and position of children and so on. And so there is there are things which I'm aware you want to be cautious of trying to push a conclusion, a doctrinal conclusion on things when in a language which you're often drawing our attention towards, and kind of therefore have got a bit of more of a fuzzy edge. But I think that there is a sense of, as I said, just as there is a natural delight and human sense of the new things that come in, that Jesus is saying the Lord enjoys that newness and the freshness. Therefore, if we want to please him, we recognize his priorities of those things. There is therefore, but it does seem to me that there is both a grace for children, and as I try to illustrate that, that a child might sometimes, in their enthusiasm for life, exaggerate things to the point of lying. There should be a grace with that because of their kind of immaturity in the process. Doesn't mean to say you can't try and shape it so that they become mature adults who are able to kind of be authentic and truthful in the world as real adults. But we want to have grace as we deal with it, and grace as we try to punish it. Because so there's both a kind of a grace that goes with it, and there's probably a sense in which what Jesus is driving at is that there is even an effectiveness in the anointing God puts on the service we have to those who are in that place. So what does it literally mean? I tend to think that when we're trying to deal with the heavenly realms, we have human level images, but we don't just replicate those in heaven. So it's not quite literally being this close to the faces. It's a bit like when we read about angels in Ezekiel with 6 wings and eyes all around. Then if you try and actually draw them literally, they look quite grotesque. And there are Christians who really believe that's how an angel looks. Even though in the New Testament there's they meet some angels after the resurrection, and Mark just calls them people. They just look like people. So they don't look like, they haven't got eyes all over their backs and whatever. So we have to understand that when we're dealing with the heavenly realms, we're using pictures rather than literally. But the issue of having the attention of the Father is really what's there. That they have access to his face means there's real attention, and it's not therefore that God in his multi-layered wisdoms and everything else doesn't notice me as an older Christian who's struggling a bit at the moment. But we should understand that somehow we're not earning privilege, we're not earning something. But actually those young children, for the very nature of their youngness and their freshness, have his attention too. I might have his attention for different reasons, but there's something in that freshness that wants to serve, that God wants to serve their needs.
So the concept of the angelic, Kristen.
Yeah.
Not just, but is that rather implying that the Father, there's the message goes to the Father hears and notices, rather than there being a specific angelic being for a child, which is...
Yes. So the use of the word angel is interesting. Is doing the Jesus-centered series through the Old Testament is how way over half, it would seem to me, I'm doing this by instinct, I haven't done a count, of times when we meet an angel in the Old Testament, they often actually become the presence of God himself, if that makes sense. So Hagar meets an angel by the well, and suddenly it's God sees her and she sees God. It's actually become God himself, and that was recognized in the rabbinic writings. You find this as well. Let's say in Philo, when he talks, the reason in the passage where he uses the word logos in the same way that John does. He talks about God being mediated by his angel, by the angel of God. So there is a kind of a sense in which we often want to make them like a kind of a totally separate created being, where sometimes it's more that how how does the Creator mediate himself into creation? Well, ultimately, all of that is through Jesus. And in some ways, sometimes people encounter it and they think of it angelically, but there clearly are other created spiritual beings. And so sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. And I think our problems sometimes come when we want to be too dogmatic one way or the other. So it's very clear, that Gabriel is a separate named spiritually created being who's talking and having a conversation with Mary, because it's the Holy Spirit who then comes on Mary and she conceives, and there's a kind of creation moment. Whereas the angel of the Lord who appears as the captain of salvation in Joshua suddenly appears and is more like God himself. The three men that Abraham meets, who then he realizes there's something angelic about them, but then they're talking in the plural and they actually also seem to be God himself. So there's it's a kind of a shifting thing. It's why I quite like, as I've used before, the fact that in the early church, before the word Trinity is invented, they talk about the perichoresis of God, the dancing aroundness of God. And actually the dancing aroundness of God even sometimes is in the presence of his mediators. Because angel in the Hebrew is simply it's a malak. And it literally just means it's a messenger, and the root of the word is actually doing something on someone else's behalf. It's a thing that God, it's something about himself that he sent on his behalf. Sometimes it seems to have his own personality and its own creative, active agency, and other times it's more of a manifestation of God himself. I'm not really helping, am I? I'm just saying.
I'm interested because we have a relative who's very much into the angelic, and just know how to respond in a way that's gracious and helpful.
Well, I think here's a good example actually of what we were looking at, because I always remember when I lived in the States for 8 months, and I went along a few times and heard John Wimber teaching on certain things. So it's nice to have had the privilege of being there. So I remember in one of those, he was talking about, someone asked a question about the role of angels in healing and so on. He talked about, as he had started to do more with traditional Pentecostals, because obviously the Vineyard were kind of that third wave, as they sometimes, third wave charismatic. And he said as he was doing stuff with more traditional Pentecostals, he said very often he'd start to be aware that, he kind of get that sense via, you say, is it coming via a word of knowledge or whatever, that maybe the Lord's over here, he's about to do something healing wise over here. And one of the people he is with would say, oh, there's an angel over there. And he was saying, so what we're both trying to do is, within our theological understanding, we're trying to recognize the activity of God. And some of those who are coming from a more traditional Pentecostal thing were talking about an angel over here. And he, in his third wave charismatic experience, was seeing that God seems to be doing something of healing over here by the Holy Spirit, you see. Now, maybe when we get there, if we really want to ask the questions, we'll find out exactly which one was which. But they often, if I can, to use the philosophical term, that phenomenologically we are experiencing something and we're then trying to interpret it. If that, so that there's something real we're encountering, and we're trying to interpret it according to our expectations, our theological understanding. But we know it's God. And we do know that certain angels seem to have real independent personalities, and then other times there's something that's called an angel. It just seems to be God. I wouldn't want to be too dogmatic one way or the other. But I think the thing we were saying is, because in kind of popular outside of church culture, kind of guardian angels, healing angels, those kind of things, they're part of a kind of a folk religion approach, and this is where we want to take on board these things. If you don't want to kind of in our high understanding be too dismissive, and actually kill the spiritual movement towards the Lord. Ultimately, at the end of the day, as we get more mature, we recognize the truth that we have direct access. But there's a difference between knowing that because you read it in the Bible and actually living in that place of access. And some people, they find it easier to go through a mediator. Sometimes that mediator is someone like me as a pastor, or probably most of you here, and sometimes it's they see it as an angel, but we're all kind of we sometimes think it'd be better to go to someone who's more mature than me. Well, what we want to do is grow them to that maturity themselves, and not be too patronizing in the approach.
Yeah, thank you, very helpful.
Thanks, Joe. Good. Anybody else like to ask anything? Or we had the whole hour now. That's always the way. It's terrible. I did think these would originally be half an hour at a time for quick lunches, but
you make it too interesting for us, Kristen.
That's very nice of you to say, Barbara. I'm thinking about how long it takes to edit to put all the things in. But good. It was really nice to see folks. It's nice to have the same sort of numbers back again after the new year and after the changes. But amen. Well, bless you guys. I will stop the recordings now.